All right, it's time for our Revelation study again. And this time we're going to go from Revelation 17:7 all the way to the end of the chapter. And we'll read that as we go. And again, thank you guys for those of you who watch these videos faithfully and who comment on the channel. I just so appreciate it. Thank you so much. And so let's get into this. Last week, we started to look at the great prostitute in Revelation 17. And we saw this was an analogy for the end time false religious system. But as the vision was playing out before John, it seems he becomes confused. So in this passage before us, the angel explains to John what he was seeing, what it meant. And as we move through this, we'll start to see the book of Revelation come together, how the pieces fit. I'm excited about this. And so let's look at the angel's explanation. He explains the vision that John was seeing. Look at Revelation 17:7. But the angel said to me, "Why do you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns that carries her." So in this passage, the angel explains to John the details about 2 individuals he has been seeing. The beast, and we'll see that in verses 8 through 17, and the prostitute in verse 18. Now, we're going to reverse that. Now, John would have understood the woman represented the false religious system, and the Antichrist would be the one the whole world will worship. But in the vision, he saw in verse 3, the woman, or the prostitute, was sitting on the beast. So somehow they were linked together. I mean, how did that fit? What was the connection? And so what we're going to do is we're going to start with the description of the woman in verse 18, then move back to the beast, work our way back. So let's look at our second section, which is identifying the woman. Verse 18, "And the woman that you saw is the great city that has dominion or reigns over the kings of the earth." Now, we saw last week that many would deny that this city is a literal city. They view it as a symbol of the religious aspect of the Antichrist empire. But there are others that would see this as being an actual city. Rome is probably the leading candidate, but Jerusalem is also in the mix. And I've even been hearing lately that America is the Babylon here. Then there are those who believe it is the actual city of Babylon that is going to be rebuilt. So is it Rome? Jerusalem? Is it America or a rebuilt Babylon? Well, time will tell, right? I mean, there are good arguments for all of these. And the reason why there are so many candidates is because Revelation doesn't make it clear what nation this is. And I think if God wanted us to know right now, he would make it obvious, and that would end the speculation. So it's going to become clear in the tribulation. It will be the capital of the Antichrist empire. And we'll look at this in more detail when we get into chapter 18. So let's move on to the description of the beast. Now, the beast, this is a fascinating and extremely evil individual who will be the leader of the last and most powerful empire the world has ever seen. And Daniel fills us in on some of the details about this man. He says he will be an intellectual genius, that's Daniel 7:8, and an outstanding orator, that's Daniel 7:20. He will also be the greatest military leader in human history, that's Daniel 7:23, as well as a shrewd, calculating, manipulating politician, that would be Daniel 8:25 and 11:21. And like I said, as we move on in the angel's explanation of the vision, we're going to start to see how the book of Revelation comes together. And so we will be doing a lot of cross-referencing because I want you to see how the pieces fit. And again, we will see that Revelation is not laid out in a chronological order. Now, it helps to understand that, doesn't it? But at the same time, it makes extra work trying to put it all together. And before we get into this next section, it's important to see what point of the tribulation we're at. This all happens around the midway point of the final 7 years. And I think it's fascinating to trace the events. Look at Revelation 17:8. "The beast that you saw was and is not, and is about to rise from the bottomless pit and go to destruction. And the dwellers on earth whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world will marvel to see the beast, because it was and is not and is to come." So we see it was and is not and is to come. Now that takes us back to what happened in Revelation 13. Look at Revelation 13:3. "One of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed, and the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast." Look at Revelation 13:14. "And by the signs that it is allowed to work in the presence of the beast, it deceives those who dwell on earth. That's talking about the false prophet, telling them to make an image for the beast that was wounded by the sword and yet lived. And so when we put those verses together, we see the beast was alive, then he was not, he died, then he was again because he rose from the dead. Then look at verse 8 again. The beast that you saw was and is not and is about to rise from the bottomless pit and go to destruction. And so what does that mean? Who's rising from the bottomless pit? Because we know that the Antichrist is a man. He was born as a man. He always lived on earth. So what is it that's rising from the bottomless pit? Now remember what the bottomless pit is? We mentioned it back in Revelation 9. It is that place where the demons are incarcerated. And in Revelation 9, 1 and 2, we saw that the devil was given the keys to it, and he unlocks it, and demons come flooding out. Now, I believe it's at this point a demon that rises from that pit will possess the Antichrist. And this is probably when the Antichrist truly becomes the beast and is totally given over to the devil. Now, watch the sequence of events after this happens. Next, the Antichrist will turn on the false religious system the prostitute represents. That's verse 16. And the 10 horns that you saw, that's the 10 other kings, we'll see that in verse 12. They and the beast will hate the prostitute. They will make her desolate and naked and devour her flesh and burn her up with fire. Now, being controlled by Satan, he will tolerate only one religion, and that is the worship of himself. And at this point, the Antichrist becomes the undisputed ruler of the world with unilateral power. And we saw last week, the world leaders will submit to him and join him in crushing the false religious system the prostitute in this vision represents. Now, if you compare scriptures, you can see the power shift from the woman to the beast, I believe. Look at the prostitute, that's Revelation 17:1. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters." Then verse 15, look at this, Revelation 17:15. And the angel said to me, "The waters that you saw where the prostitute is seated are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages." So at this point, the leaders of this false religious system have incredible influence and power over all peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. But watch what happens. Here's the beast in Revelation 13:7. We're back in Revelation 13. Also, it was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them, and authority was given it over. Now listen to this. And authority was given it over every tribe and people and language and nation. Right there, I believe, is the shift of power after the prostitute is crushed. At this point, after he has consolidated his power, then the next thing is he's going to stroll into the temple, claiming to be God and demanding to be worshipped. That's the abomination of desolation that Daniel talked about in Daniel 9:27, and Jesus talked about in Matthew 24:15. Then Revelation 13 tells us the false prophet will begin to promote the beast, demanding that the world worships him. And at this point, the mark of the beast will be introduced to designate those who do. Also, at the same time, God will send 3 angels that everybody on earth will see and hear. That's in Revelation 14. They will proclaim the gospel and warn the people of the consequences of taking the mark. And let me say again, the vaccine is not the mark. I see this all over the place. Let's be biblical. It is not about disease. It is about devotion to the beast. It will be a conscious, willing choice to reject God and embrace the Antichrist and worship him. Then, finally, at the height of his power, he will foolishly feel he can thwart the coming of Christ. He will unite the nations of the world against Christ, but he will be soundly defeated. And verse 8 speaks about his end. Look at verse 8 again. The beast that you saw was and is not and is about to rise from the bottomless pit and go to destruction. That is the eternal lake of fire, or hell. Revelation 19:20 says, "And the beast was captured, and with it the false prophet, who in its presence had done the signs by which he deceived those who had received the mark of the beast and those who worshipped its image. These 2 were thrown alive into the lake of fire that burns with sulfur." Then notice the unbeliever's reaction to the Antichrist's death and resurrection. Revelation 17:8, "And the dwellers on earth whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world will marvel to see the beast, because it was and is not and is to come." So people are going to marvel at this man who was killed but came back to life. They're just going to be amazed. Revelation 13:3 and 4, One of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed, and the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast. And they worshiped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast, and they worshiped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast, and who can fight against it?" So they look at this individual and they're thinking, wow, they killed him, but death could not hold him. He rose again. Now he has all this power. This guy is amazing. The world is going to be thrilled, infatuated by this man. But also notice this is only the unbelievers who end up being deceived by him. Revelation 17:8, and the dwellers on earth whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world will marvel to see the beast, because it was and is not and is to come. This shows us when the believer is saved in God's mind, doesn't it? Ephesians 1:4 says, even as he chose us in him before the foundation of the world. Then Revelation 17 verse 8 tells us this is also the point the names were recorded in his book, the book of life. And here we see the elect, or the believers, will not fall for the Antichrist deception. Matthew 24:24, Jesus said, for false Christ and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. You know what? It won't be possible because God is going to sustain them. He has promised that he will finish what he began. And when did he begin that work in us, in the believer? In his mind, it was before the foundation of the world, right? Those recorded in the book of life then will make it to be with him in the end. He promised. Now, John goes on in verse 9 to explain the vision further, and notice how he introduces it. Revelation 17:9, this calls for a mind with wisdom. In other words, this is complicated. You're going to have to think, and it will take wisdom and spiritual insight. And I have a feeling only those who are alive at this time are going to fully comprehend it. I mean, looking at it from this distance, before it happens, there's going to be much speculation, and we see that through the book of Revelation, as there's so many opinions about what so many things mean. So look at verse 9. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. Now, like we said last week, some believe this verse is speaking of Rome because Rome is known as the city of 7 hills. But this isn't hills. The Greek word means mountains. And as I said last time, I think this end-time religion is much larger than just the Catholic Church. The Antichrist empire is a worldwide empire and will encompass much of the Protestant church too. So what we have here is a uniting of all the religions into one giant ecumenical movement that will join together to worship and serve the beast. Plus, this verse clearly identifies these mountains as 7 kings. Look at verse 10. The mountains, are also 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen. One is, the other has not yet come, and when he does come, he must remain only a little while. Now, mountains were used at times in the Old Testament as metaphors representing rule or power. Here they represent 7 empires. 5 have fallen, 1 is, and 1 has not yet come. And so the 5 Gentile world empires that had fallen by the time of John's vision are Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece. The one that existed at the time of this writing was obviously Rome, and the other one that has not yet come is Antichrist's final world empire. But when he does come, it says he must remain only a little while. In other words, his empire will be short-lived. That's Revelation 13:5. And the beast was given a mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. That is the final 3.5 years of the tribulation period. That's when all this begins. So his empire was allowed by God for a little while. Why? To accomplish his divine purposes. 3.5 years is an incredibly short time for a kingdom, isn't it? Then the angel continues in verse 11, Revelation 17:11. As the beast that was and is not is an 8, but it belongs to the 7, and it goes to destruction. Well, how can Antichrist be an 8th king, but also be one of the 7? I think the clue is in the phrase that was and is not. He was one of the 7 kings before his mortal wound and supposed death. Then, after his resurrection, which will be the second phase of his rule, he'll be the 8th king. And again, it says he goes to destruction. That's the lake of fire. Then in verse 12 again, and the 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received royal power. When John was writing this, they had not yet ascended to power. John is writing about kings that will be in power in the Antichrist future empire. And he's probably speaking about the 10-nation confederation that Daniel speaks about, that will rise up in Europe, and that will be the nations the Antichrist comes out of, I believe. Verse 12 continues, but they are to receive authority as kings for 1 hour together with the beast. It seems the Antichrist empire will be divided into these 10 regions, and it says authority for 1 hour. That is a figure of speech emphasizing brevity. Their reign will be short-lived because their master's empire itself will be short-lived, as we've seen already, 42 months. But during their brief reign, they are going to be unanimously devoted to Antichrist. Look at the next verse, verse 13. These are of one mind, and they hand over their power and authority to the beast. Of one mind. In other words, they will have one purpose, which is the agenda of the beast. And just as the world worships him, so will they. Therefore, they willingly submit themselves to him, giving him total authority. Then the next verse tells us what the will of the beast is that they're devoted to. Look at verse 14. They will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them. So they will make war on the Lamb at the Battle of Armageddon. And this takes us back to Revelation 16, where we see how these kings are called into battle. This is interesting. Revelation 16, verse 13 and 14 says, and I saw coming out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet, 3 unclean spirits like frogs. For they are demonic spirits performing signs, who go abroad to the kings of the whole world to assemble them for battle on the great day of God the Almighty. Then Revelation 16:16, and they assembled them at the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon. So these 3 powerful demons are sent to gather the nations to that battle. And we have to wait until chapter 19 to get any details on it. But here John simply tells us the Lamb will conquer these kings. Then he tells us why the outcome of the battle is assured. Look at verse 14 again. For he is the Lord of lords and King of kings. These nations that have been deceived, who think they can actually win this war, obviously haven't thought through the issues of who they're going up against. This is the one who created the universe easily. No striving or straining, just 3 simple words, let there be, and there was. And so when we see the details of this, we'll find out that this was no contest. This is going to be a slaughter, and the Lord is going to easily win it. Now look at who the Lord returns with. Revelation 17:14, they will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those with him are called and chosen and faithful. These are the true believers, those whose names have been written in the Lamb's book of life, chosen from before the foundation of the earth. And notice 3 things about them. These 3 things are true about all saints. As I've already mentioned, they are chosen before the foundations of the earth. That's Ephesians 1:4. Next, they are called. So this choice in God's mind before the foundation of the world becomes a reality in our life through this call. That's when God draws us to him, when he illuminates the truth of the gospel, so we see our sinful state and our need of a Savior. When we truly understand the reality of our condition, that we are guilty and lost and deserving only hell. Do you remember that? I mean, that is powerful, isn't it? That is powerful enough to overcome our natural hostility towards God. Romans 8:7 says, for the mind that is set on the flesh is hostile to God, for it does not submit to God's law. Indeed, it cannot. And so we see who we really are. We see that we are sinners before Almighty God, and we deserve only hell. And what that does is that wakes us up. And that truth becomes irresistible, and it draws us to Christ. And we place our faith in him, and we're saved. Have you ever thought about what a miracle salvation is? Think about it. We turn away from the sin we always loved and embrace the God we never wanted. Let me say that again. We turn away from the sin we always loved and embrace the God we never wanted. And God enables us to do that when he draws us. Then the last one is faithful. This is the evidence of being saved, the evidence of God's saving work in you. Think about what happens at salvation. We have a new nature with new holy desires, and the Holy Spirit moves in and empowers us to live out those new desires. Therefore, you no longer live like you used to. You've been changed, radically changed. You now live for Christ. And this isn't to be saved, is it? You live this way now because you are saved. It's just the fruit of salvation. It's the proof that you've been saved, that God has done that internal work in you. Now let's close with the crushing of the prostitute. Look at Revelation 17, verse 16 and 17. And the 10 horns that you saw, they and the beast will hate the prostitute. They will make her desolate and naked and devour her flesh and burn her up with fire. For God has put into their hearts to carry out his purpose by being of one mind and handing over their royal power to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. So the Antichrist partnership with the false religious system, it's not going to last, is it? Eventually, he and these 10 kings who rule under him will grow to hate the prostitute and will completely, absolutely destroy her. So it seems he uses the system, or he games the system to gain control of the world. Then after getting what he wants, he just discards it. So he wants the world to worship only him. And I imagine he also covets the vast wealth of that false religious system. And notice the extreme violence he and those serving under him will use. Again, verse 16, and the 10 horns that you saw, they and the beast will hate the prostitute. They will make her desolate and naked and devour her flesh and burn her up with fire. There is no mercy here. They are ruthless, and they are going to obliterate this false religious system. There will be nothing left. Anything that even hints of it will be destroyed. Then in verse 17, we see that none of this has happened outside of God's sovereign plan. So let's look at the sovereign plan of God. Verse 17, for God has put into their hearts to carry out his purpose by being of one mind and handing over their royal power to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. So God directed his judgment against religious Babylon. Just as he used other nations to execute judgment on Israel for her sins, he now uses the Antichrist and these 10 kings to destroy this false, idolatrous, end-time religion. So here we get a view into how God sometimes will use Satan to accomplish his purposes. Satan sends the demon to draw the nations into war, but here we see it is God who puts into their mind that willingness to be drawn. It is God who causes them to respond to that drawing of the demon. Little do they know, though, that they are being drawn into judgment. So the point is, God is sovereign, and everything in the end will work out to accomplish his purposes. Everything. Then John adds, Revelation 17:17 again, until the words of God are fulfilled. This is speaking of all the words of God that spoke of Christ's return as setting up his kingdom. They're all going to be fulfilled. And that's what we're seeing right here, isn't it? It's just God setting the stage for the return of his Son. So let's conclude this then. Here we see that God hates false religion, and he will not tolerate it in his creation. But as I was studying this, I thought, what is the greatest false religion today? You know what I think it is? I think it is the worship of self. It's meism. We're on the throne of our life. We're number one. Everything is about us. But you know what? That can only end up in one place, joining the head of that religion, Satan, in hell. And so the solution is to devote yourself to God and his ways instead, to descend the throne of your heart and allow him to ascend and rule, to go to him and ask him to save you, and to trust in his Son alone, trusting in his work as being enough to cleanse you from your guilt and make you heaven ready. Oh, I pray that you'll do that today. I pray today would be the day that you come to know God as Father instead of as Judge. I pray today is the day that you'll become his child and heaven will become your home. All right, guys, well, that's all I got. Thank you for hanging out with me and watching this whole video, and I'll see you in the next video. God bless you.